The world of Cyberpunk is one in which crime runs rampant. Corporations have become more powerful and better armed than national governments, and cybernetic enhancements can augment an individual's abilities, but often at the cost of their humanity. This dystopian fictional future is populated by a host of corpos and rocker boys, chromed out netrunners and IRA gunners. Dear guests, welcome to Fantasy Ireland, a series in which I analyse the references to Ireland in science fiction, fantasy, and media in general by looking at the source material, the writers, and contemporary real-world events. So, put a shillelagh in your ear and stick a shamrock up your nose, and we'll be off to take a look at Ireland in the world of Cyberpunk. The first edition of the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game was developed by Mike Pondsmith and released by Talsorian Games in 1988, and it was set in the far-flung future of 2013. In this alternate future, the world stock market crash of 1994 has exacerbated the homelessness and unemployment crisis suffered by the United States, leading to the collapse of 1996, with many US cities declaring bankruptcy. Europe is more insulated from this crisis, having formed the European Economic Community in 1992, which Ireland joined the following year. Of all the major megacorps described in the first edition source material, only World News Service has regional offices based in Ireland, with one in Belfast and the other in Shannon. In future source material, neither of these regional offices are mentioned, possibly indicating that they have pulled out of the island. A new edition of Cyberpunk was released in 1990, set in the year 2020, and in this we begin to see an Irish presence in Night City itself. This is where most of the action in Cyberpunk takes place. It's a violent hellscape on the west coast of America, where you can gain fame and fortune and get yourself killed in the process. Sometimes that's actually a requirement for the fame part. The north side district of Night City is described as an aging industrial neighbourhood and one of the worst areas in the city for gang violence. It is here that we find Holy Angels Church with traditional Latin Mass delivered by Father Kevin from Belfast. Father Kevin was a solo in his younger days who grew sick of wholesale destruction and human intolerance, believing that only charity and divine grace could save humanity. He has a reputation for peacefully settling gang and corporation problems and has invoked the sanctity of the church before the law on a few occasions when trying to defuse gang conflicts. We're also told that Holy Angels Church is one fun place to be on St. Patrick's Day, as out-of-town tourists are drawn to its popular snake races. Well, I'm sure the other fun place to be on St. Patrick's Day is directly across the street from the church at O'Flaherty's Tavern. In the year 2020, O'Flaherty's serves good Irish whiskey and hearty Irish home cooking 7 days a week, being famed for its beer and corned beef. The tavern also has vidboards always set to soccer and rugby matches. We're told that, if you want to fit in at O'Flaherty's, don't ask for your beer cold, oh dear Christ almighty. It's also helpful if you speak Gaelic, but not necessary. Right, well, first of all, warm beer is an English thing, and I am outraged that a supposed Irish bar wouldn't know this. I'll be leaving a negative review on CyberYelp. You might find the reference to Gaelic odd, but the second edition core rulebook contains a list of languages from which players can pick when building their character, including the Celtic languages of Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton. Scots Gaelic has been left out, and these Celtic languages will be joining it by 2045, as none of them are included in the most recent core rulebook. I get the feeling that the writing team has made the mistake of seeing the Irish reference football and have confused it for soccer. As we're about to see, considering that this was written in 1990, I don't think the regular clientele of O'Flaherty's would be fans of Garrison games. Because should you venture into O'Flaherty's, you might raise the suspicion of the Night City Police. You see, they believe that its owner, Daniel O'Flaherty, harbours local countrymen in trouble and suspect the bar itself of being a stop on the Underground Railroad for IRA members, where deals for weapons destined for the Northern Irish Pacification Zone take place. More on that shortly. It's also unwise to ask too many questions, as a heavily armed man at the bar could be a local Northside tech or an IRA gunner on the run. Most certainly the staff of Universal Export in the docks of East Marina would be unwelcome at O'Flaherty's. To the passive observer, it's a consulting firm that specialises in sea freight tariffs and standard shipping routes, boring stuff like that. But rumour has it that the offices are a front for the British government's notorious Army Intelligence Active Service, Armintac, particularly its branches dealing with covert anti-IRA operations in the United States. If so, then they are presumably keeping their eyes on Dylan Murphy, a soft-spoken 21-year-old solo who speaks with a thick Irish accent and bears a resemblance to a certain Rory Maguire, an IRA gunner from Belfast who escaped a maximum security prison. Behind his back, Murphy is known as the White Knight of Night City for his chivalrous streak that causes him to protect women and children, sometimes even without pay. He also has a soft spot for pretty girls, most preferably redheads, with little or no cyberware and lots of freckles. In Cyberpunk, characters can have skills which range from 1, indicating that they are a novice, to 10, a master of the craft. As well as 10 in handgun and 9 for melee weapon, Murphy has just a 3 in play Celtic harp, a 2 in dance, and a middle-of-the-road 5 in Gaelic. Well, you know what they say. Is fear Gaeilge briste ná Cybertech cliste. Okay, that's all well and good, but what about Ireland itself, and what's this Northern Irish Pacification Zone? Well, for that, we need to turn to Eurosource, a sourcebook dealing with the European Economic Community and the wider Euro theatre. In Eurosource, the major movers and shakers are given dedicated entries detailing their history, politics, economy, and culture, but Ireland receives only a short sidebar note tacked onto the entry for the United Kingdom. The effects of global warming have led Ireland to apply for EC funds with which to diversify its agricultural base, and the vineyards and maize fields of Munster serve as proof of the campaign's success. No doubt, Ireland's applications were looked upon favourably by Irishman Jean McSharry, the EC Commissioner for Food. In London and Belfast, however, there is a strong suspicion that the development funds secured for Irish agriculture are actually being sent to the rebels in Northern Ireland, with the full knowledge of the EC. There, the SAS and Armintac carry out the search and destroy missions that characterise the brutal, tragic war against anti-government forces. These include the IRA, an umbrella group that unites a range of Catholic Republican groups that carry out terrorist and conventional military operations, Brendan McGarrahy's Warriors of Erin, and the anarchists of Cell 14. We're also told that there are movements opposed to the government on other than sectarian grounds, as well as the Orange Hundreds, Protestant vigilantes too brutal even for the government, carrying out their own brand of counter-insurgency. The brief description of the public enemies inhabiting Northern Ireland and the terminology used is rather peculiar. It describes a sectarian focus to the Republican paramilitaries, but describes the presumably loyalist Orange Hundreds as counter-insurgents. The fact that they are too brutal even for the government would indicate the existence of groups that are not too brutal for the government, an acknowledgement of the collusion between British armed forces and loyalist paramilitaries in the real-world troubles raging in Northern Ireland at the time this sourcebook was published in 1991. There is also something pointedly strange about the description of Ireland in Eurosource. The country is actually referred to by a number of different names throughout, but the one thing it is never called is Ireland. It's called the Emerald Isle, Southern Ireland with a capital S, a state that existed briefly under British law between 1920 and 1922, and Ira, a misspelling of Éire, the Irish word for Ireland. Now you might just think the writers didn't have a keyboard with the Sína Fada on it, but there are a number of other non-English words and names in this sourcebook which include the correct accents. The bizarre choice to use era and to misspell it seems to be intentional. Time for a quick history lesson. In 1937, the Irish Free State adopted a new constitution, which asserted that the national territory consists of the whole island, and declared the name of the country to be Éire in the Irish language, while Ireland was to be used in English. But the British government considered that to do so would be to grant acknowledgement of the Constitution's implicit claim to Northern Ireland. They instead insisted on referring to the state in all official documents as Éire, but without the Fada. This remained official British government policy until the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and the term was also widely used by British media. The refusal to use the name Ireland, down to this very day in some cases, was seen as an insult and battled vigorously by Irish officials. Considering that Eurosource was published in 1991, the overly sectarian emphasis of the conflict in Northern Ireland and the repeated use of the purposefully misspelled term Éire makes it seem as though the writer is applying an official British narrative to a science fiction future. So, it mightn't come as any surprise to discover that Eurosource was written by Mark Galeotti, a British graduate of Cambridge and the London School of Economics, where he completed a doctorate in 1992, the year after Eurosource was published. Today, Galeotti is considered an expert on Russia and is often requested to write articles or go on podcasts to give his opinion on the course of the conflict in Ukraine, so he doesn't have much reason to refer to Ireland, but when he does, he at least uses its correct name now. Most recently, he argued that a border poll on the status of Northern Ireland would play into Russian hands, so he's also still towing that British line. By 1991, the troubles in Northern Ireland had been ongoing for 22 years. Though the most violent days were in the past and peace would come in 7 years' time, it wasn't completely out of the ordinary to imagine that the conflict would continue for decades yet. But Galeotti seems to be reiterating the British narrative of the contemporary conflict instead of imagining what it would look like in the cyberpunk future of 2020, especially considering the lore that he himself created for the United Kingdom. In Eurosource, we're told that the British military seized power in a coup in 2001, and when the reigning monarch, King Charles III, refused to legitimise the coup, he and the majority of the British royal family were hunted down and liquidated. The Martial Law Provisional Council then split the United Kingdom into 8 martial law authorities, with General Lord Mackenzie ruling the Northern Irish Pacification Authority from Belfast. So it's this martial law authority that the IRA is opposed to on sectarian grounds, while the Orange Hundreds, named for their devotion to King William of Orange, zealously support those who have just executed his descendants and abolished the monarchy. Galeotti might have been constrained by the reference to the IRA operating in the Night City sourcebook, but his depiction in Eurosource doesn't really make any sense, unless you read it as a slightly fictionalized commentary on the real-world troubles of 1991, not the cyberpunk of 2020. Okay then, we have dealt with a lot of lore there. We've dealt with history and with politics, and if you feel that you haven't gotten a full grasp of it all, don't worry. It's all been retconned, so you can forget everything I've just said. Eurosource was just 80 pages long, and in the years after its publication, more detailed source material for other world regions was released. Because of this, and objections to its content, which I will get back to, an expanded sourcebook was released in 1995 covering Europe, called Eurosource Plus. The operations of the Euro Council are described here in greater detail, though we're not told the names of any of the commissioners, so we don't know if MacSharry is still in control of food. All of the nations of the EC, from the great to the small, have been given a detailed entry, including the only nation with 2 names, Ireland Irai. Well look, it's an improvement over Eurosource, I think. Ireland has been completely reworked in Eurosource Plus. Now, in the Cyberpunk of 2020, it has a population of 4 million people and a military of 29,000. Ireland's position on the edge of Europe makes it popular with smugglers and people hoping to slip into Europe undetected. Irish law enforcement is aware of the smuggling, but only steps in if the smuggled items breach one of the unwritten rules both sides seem to work by. This lack of effort on Ireland's part to combat smuggling often angers the EC. As Ireland has remained relatively untouched by modern civilization throughout the 20th century, laws have been put in place by the Irish and EC governments to keep it unspoiled and to limit the activities of corporations. Grants are given to maintain the historical theme of the country, and all internal travel is by authentic, though non-polluting replicas of vehicles from the 20th century, or earlier. New buildings must blend in with older buildings, and in the countryside, houses are maintained in their original condition. Some of these dwellings have no modern conveniences to show exactly how people lived before the EC ensured its equal lowest standard of living. Thanks, Europe? The entire country is, in effect, the world's largest theme park, with many corporations basing their rest and stress relief centres here. Dublin is one of the few places in Ireland where any form of modern industry is located, but in general, great care has been taken to keep it as untouched by progress as possible. Among the major tourist attractions in the city is the Phoenix Park, with its wonderful animals. In future episodes, we'll see that this depiction of Ireland as unindustrialised and unindustrialisable is not unique to Cyberpunk. There are a few other references to Ireland in 2nd edition sourcebooks. In Eurotour, a campaign in which Mark Galeotti served as one of the 3 writers, the player characters start stranded in Liverpool, where they will become involved in the European music tour of rocker boy Jack Entropy. One of the suggestions for why the player characters find themselves in Liverpool is that they were working on the England-Ireland Tunnel, which would have run from Liverpool to the Isle of Man and from there to Dublin. Ballooning costs, insurrectionist trouble, and political pressure from radicals in both England and Ireland caused the project to go belly up. Sadly, Entropy's tour doesn't have a stop in Ireland, even though the tunnel inspired one of his songs, Boring Through My Heart. In 2020, Lazarus is the largest private military contractor in the world. The second highest ranking military officer in the company is Colonel Douglas Llewellyn, formerly of the British Royal Marines, who completed tours of duty in numerous conflict zones, including Northern Ireland.
Ooh, crack up the mick.
Galeotti's depiction of Northern Ireland in the original Eurosource left a lot to be desired, but I rather his depiction of agricultural powerhouse Ira over the uncivilized Ireland of Eurosource Plus. However, Galeotti upset one nationality so much that a group of writers demanded that they be allowed to write a dedicated sourcebook to correct the injustice done to their country. Who was it that felt so offended with Galeotti's work? It was the English.
They didn't like how we had treated England in the original Euro book. And they said, we want to fix this. And we say, well, how do you want to fix this? And he said, we're going to bring back the king. And there's going to be a revolution. Okay, yeah, that's just kind of out of left field, nutty enough. Go ahead.
Rough Guide to the UK was published in 1994 and is a sequel to Eurosource Plus, which wouldn't be published until a year later. The United Kingdom of Eurosource Plus was largely the same as Galeotti's. The military had taken over, liquidated the monarchy, and established martial law authorities. Rough Guide then sets about undoing all of this by introducing an enemy that stretched the military junta's resources to the very limits. The Scottish.
You goddamned evil Mr. Jocks.
An uprising by the Scottish in 2016 compounded the problems caused by IRA and INLA incursions in Northern Ireland, and this led to a monarchist revival spearheaded by Princess Beatrice, one of the only surviving members of the royal family. Sensing what way things were going, General Lord Mackenzie threw his support behind the monarchists. With the United Kingdom on the verge of civil war, a spate of assassinations took out virtually all the major players opposed to the restoration. This was followed up by the disappearance of leading members of the Scottish and Northern Irish separatist movements. Beatrice was crowned Victoria II, and as a reward, Mackenzie was made Chief of Staff of the military, which was then privatised, becoming chairman of the British Combined Forces plc, or the BCF. Rough Guide continues with the practice of referring to Ireland as Eire, even calling it the Southern Republic of Eire at one stage, and states that Ulster is another name for Northern Ireland, using both terms interchangeably. Set in the year 2023, the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland continues even after the disappearance of the main nationalist leaders, a plot point that is never mentioned again. The conflict in Northern Ireland is put on par with Beirut and Bosnia, and Belfast is described as the one place in the world more dangerous than Night City. Policing in Northern Ireland no longer exists. It was briefly carried out by forces from Arasaka, before their representative in the region was kidnapped and their facilities firebombed. Arasaka is also suspected of supplying weapons to nationalist forces in Northern Ireland. I guess if you can't police them, arm them. There's a quote from the section on Northern Ireland that's worth giving in full to show the bias of these British writers and how they parroted in full the contemporary British narrative of the conflict. Things seemed to be picking up for the province when Britain bowed to pressure and pulled most of the troops out of Ulster. The problem was that the Catholics, nationalists, were then made to remember why they were sent there in the first place. To protect them. The Protestants, loyalists, alarmed at the explosion in the nationalist birth rate, launched a fierce campaign of bombing and assassinations against the Catholic population. Naturally, the nationalists responded with a terror campaign of their own, both in the province and on the mainland. The government responded by allowing the Ulster Defence Regiment to shoot to kill if attacked. They already did this anyway, but it's nice to know you have government permission to blow someone's brains out. Throughout Rough Guide, the writers have made a number of allusions to British history in depicting the United Kingdom of tomorrow. The liquidation of the British royal family, taken from Eurosource, has been given the name Operation Cromwell, and the restoration of the monarchy in 2017 mirrors the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. The Scottish uprising might reference the 1689 Jacobite Rising, and England and Wales have been split into a number of new martial law authorities which somewhat reflect medieval and Norman divisions. Northern Ireland is spared such intelligent analysis though, and instead the writers go back just 25 years to reframe the start of the still ongoing conflict. In the late 1960s, civil rights movements in Northern Ireland calling for an end to discriminatory practices in employment, housing allocation and voting rights were used to stoke fears in the unionist community. The Reverend Ian Paisley, who is now generally regarded as the main instigator of the Troubles, declared that the Catholic nationalist minority breed like rabbits and multiply like vermin, and his supporters undertook counter-marches which violently opposed the civil rights campaign. Rioting in August of 1969, caused by triumphalist loyalist marches and the Royal Ulster Constabulary storming of the Bogside, led to thousands of mostly Catholic families being burnt out of their homes. With the situation spiralling out of control and the RUC literally fanning the flames, the British Army was deployed to the streets of Northern Ireland at the request of the Unionist government. So yes, the British armed forces were indeed deployed to protect the nationalist community, who initially welcomed them with open arms. But to write this in 1994, considering subsequent events, is highly inflammatory and frankly spiteful. With the withdrawal of the British Army in Rough Guide, the Ulster Defence Regiment has been left behind and given permission to shoot to kill if threatened. The UDR was a real infantry regiment established in 1970 which colluded actively with loyalist paramilitaries, or counterinsurgents as Eurosource would call them. In 1992, 2 years before Rough Guide was published, the UDR was merged with the Royal Irish Rangers to form the Royal Irish Regiment. Instead of drawing from history to imagine a cyberpunk future for Northern Ireland, as they have done with the rest of the United Kingdom, the writers instead seek to reinforce the contemporary British narrative that the army was there to maintain peace in an exclusively sectarian conflict waged by an inherently violent people, and fantasize about the Irish getting their just comeuppance when the army is withdrawn. There are a few other references to Ireland and Northern Ireland in the Rough Guide. We're told that Ireland takes the brunt of the acid rain coming in from the Atlantic, sparing Britain the worst effects. In the days before the Restoration, a demilitarised zone was declared around Ulster to counteract IRA and INLA incursions. The border with the Southern Republic of Era has also been closed, apart from a few selected crossing points, and smugglers there can help you get across the DMZ for a large fee. There are, however, no tourist sites in Northern Ireland. Tourists are not allowed to enter Northern Ireland, and anyone claiming to be a tourist will be shot out of hand by the BCF. There are also a few pagan groups inspired by Celtic mythology, such as the Children of Danu, who use as their symbol a shamrock, because that has no Christian connotations whatsoever. But these groups only appear to be present on the mainland, which is another oft-repeated phrase. The Law and Order section describes policing in Scotland, Era, and Northern Ireland. At times you begin to question if some of the writers thought Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom. Finally, on the map of Northern Ireland, they've managed to label Belfast as Dublin. That could be a reason for the bankruptcy of the England-Ireland tunnel. They were digging in the wrong direction. There was also the 17 bomb attempts on the tunnel before somebody got it right. Now, thankfully, after all that, it's time to leave the second edition behind us. The game went on hiatus in 1998, but in 2005, a new core rulebook was released, pushing Cyberpunk into the year 2030 something. In the early 2020s of this edition, Raish Barthmos's data crash rendered the net utterly unusable, and the detonation of a nuclear device at the base of Arasaka Towers in 2022, yes, you heard me correctly, reduced the center of Night City to radioactive waste. Gangs from the surrounding combat zone invaded the crippled city, murdering, looting, and carving out new territory for themselves. If Night City was to survive, it needed defenders, heroes who would drive back the invaders and unite the people. Into the breach, one organization stepped, an organization often vilified but resolute in its determination to defend the local communities. This organization was the Irish Republican Army. In the winter of 1992, Dylan Murphy, Dylan with a Y, so a totally different Dylan to the one in 2nd edition, was born into the crushing poverty of Galway. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and eventually his mother fled with her children to Dublin. There, Dylan fell in with nationalist gangs, and at 17, he made the acquaintance of a young Republican radical called Ardal Mullaney. Mullaney offered him the opportunity to take the fight to the enemy, and Murphy joined the Sons of Finn Sinn Féin. Now, I don't know if the writing team are trying to pass Sons of Finn off as a translation of Sinn Féin, or if the full name is the Sons of Finn Sinn Féin, in opposition to, we'll say, the Sons of Finn Republican Sinn Féin, two completely different Sons of Finn. And it doesn't really matter, because the very next sentence in Beyond the Edge, the sourcebook written by Mark Pondsmith where this profile is taken from, treats the two as separate organisations. While Sinn Féin negotiated with Westminster, the Sons of Finn carried out an elaborate bombing campaign on the British mainland. Yeah, well, bombing the Isle of Iona probably wouldn't get you anywhere. The IRA was outraged that the political process had been destabilised by the Sun's actions and passed on their identities to the British government. The Suns were then wiped out by the SAS in synchronised raids across Dublin, with only Murphy and Mullany surviving. They both escaped to the United States using false passports bought on the black market in the Gaeltacht.
Can't win anyways!
Murphy headed for Night City on the west coast, while Mullany settled in Boston, becoming a priest under his assumed name of Kevin Sullivan, and campaigned for the cause of Irish liberation, accumulating funds for a promised future uprising in the old country. Soon, however, he found that there was very little will to help the cause directly by taking up arms. He had plenty of guns, but no hands to put them in. Disillusioned, Father Kevin left for Night City in 2016, taking over the care of Holy Angels Church. There he gave spiritual aid to those in need, and those in need of stronger assistance he sent across the street to Dylan Murphy at O'Flaherty's Tavern. When the nuke leveled the city centre, Father Kevin opened up his hidden cache of weapons once destined for the IRA and rallied the old exiled Fenians in his congregation to defend the locality. Though a difficult task initially, he finally managed to convince Murphy to train and recruit an army that would become known as the Edge Runners. I won't go into the full history of events ahead, but eventually Father Kevin and Murphy would save Night City, establish and lead the Edge Runner Convention, and fall out over the control and supply of New Cyb, the replacement for cyberware that didn't require surgery or threaten cyberpsychosis. Both have stat blocks in the Beyond the Edge sourcebook. Unlike his earlier incarnation in 2nd edition, Dylan with an I, Dylan with a Y has no skills in Gaelic or Celtic harp. Father Kevin has armoured robes and has a level of 6 in the skill Expert Catholicism. When has any GM ever called for an Expert Catholicism check in a game? What would an Expert Catholicism check even look like?
Guns don't work on Sunday.
Beyond the Edge was written almost a decade after the Good Friday Agreement brought the Troubles in Northern Ireland to an end, and I'm not sure if this is the peace process destabilised by Sinn Féin's bombing campaign. There are actually a few major discrepancies in the profiles of Father Kevin and Dylan which confuse the situation in Ireland. In Father Kevin's, they flee British retaliation for the bombing campaign, while in Dylan's it is the IRA that rats them out. But if that's the case, then why is Father Kevin still procuring weapons for them? And if the IRA is engaged in a peace process, then who's organising this planned uprising, and who's it against? The descriptions of the Irishmen's lives in America shows at least some familiarity with contemporary and older Irish-American traditions. Boston was indeed an important source of funds and weapons during the Troubles, and woe betide anyone who didn't put a few dollars in the collection jar when it came out at the local pub. But the old exiled Fenians and the collection of funds for a promised future uprising in the old country, well, that sounds more like the 1920s than the 2020s, if not even earlier. But we don't need to worry about all this right now. The gangs have been defeated and some level of peace brought to the Edgerunner conclaves. The Japanese military dictatorship has executed Saburo Arasaka for his crimes, and the supply of New Cyb has been secured. It is now time for the Edgerunners. It is now time for the Edgerunners to lead Night City into a bright new future. And if this bright new future doesn't sound familiar to you, it's because it was retconned in its entirety. Version 3 wasn't well received when it was released. Many players felt it was too much of a departure from 2nd edition, and that it heavily altered or removed key elements of what made Cyberpunk Cyberpunk. The edition is mostly remembered and derided for its use of action figures in the core rulebook, and the 3D computer graphics used in the sourcebooks aren't much better. the majority of players continued using the 2nd edition 2020 setting, and when Cyberpunk RED was released in 2020, it continued on with this timeline, but incorporated the best ideas, of which there were plenty, from version 3. And so that time the IRA saved Night City, faded out of canon and into obscurity. In Cyberpunk RED, set in the year 2045, we find that Dylan with an I, the IRA gunner that escaped a maximum security prison in Belfast back in 2020, has married one of those pretty redheads he had an eye for, and has settled down to raise a horde of children. Maybe Ian Paisley was onto something. Now middle-aged, he's still known for his cool head and a fast 44. Father Kevin still offers Holy Angels Church for the mediation of gang disputes, with the 6th Street Gang serving as its welcome protectors. The map of Night City has changed significantly between 2nd and 4th edition, but the new Cyberpunk RED map shows the location of Holy Angels Church in the year 2045. There is no mention, however, of O'Flaherty's. Perhaps there is no longer a conflict in Ireland to supply with weapons, and in turn supply O'Flaherty's with its clientele of exiled IRA gunners. So that covers Ireland in the various editions of the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game. The references to Ireland and the IRA from the core writing team at Talsorian are dramatically different to those made by the British writers on the 2nd edition sourcebooks. The core team uses the actual name of the country for one, and we do have a potential source for some of these references. Way back in 2018, on the Cyberpunk 2020 subreddit, Mike Pondsmith himself responded to a question about some of the iconic characters from the setting. Pondsmith said that the likes of Johnny Silverhand and Morgan Blackhand were created by him but were never used as player characters, unlike Spider Murphy and Dylan with a Y, who were created by his wife Lisa. 3 years later, in response to a different question about where Spider's name came from, Mike said that Lisa didn't remember, but that Spider was a tech character with a Romany and Irish background that she had played in a previous game run by him. So it looks like at least one of the Dylanses was also a player character created by Lisa in games she played, and it's possible that parts of the backstory she created for him were incorporated into Cyberpunk's lore. This would explain why reading their profiles makes it feel like you've missed out on an entire other sourcebook. Who the hell is Rory Maguire? What the hell are the Sons of Finn? Why the hell are the beers warm? And where the hell is the Gaeltacht? It's possible that the answers to these questions were all worked out in the very earliest days of Cyberpunk, and were included as an homage to those far-off distant days. I'm just speculating here, but wherever they came from, the Irish references in the core sourcebooks show at least an awareness and an appreciation of Irish-American traditions, an at times hazy understanding of Ireland itself, and an absence of the disdain and condescension shown in the British authored material. I chanced my arm and emailed a few questions to Talsorian, but I think that British Armantech has been monitoring and blocking my communications. And now we turn to Cyberpunk 2077, which has very few Irish references. If we visit the location indicated on the 2045 map, there is no sign of either Holy Angels Church or O'Flaherty's Tavern. We've seen that Spider Murphy is based on a character of Romany and Irish heritage, though this isn't attested in any of the sourcebooks or the 2077 game. All the same, as is typically Irish, we'll claim her as one of our own anyway. The World of Cyberpunk 2077 artbook mentions that the 6th Street Gang hangs out at Pig Boy's Delight Irish Bar in Santo Domingo. I don't know if this is an actual location in the game, I haven't found it, but if anyone has, please comment below if they have bacon fries or snack bars. During the Never Fade Away quest, Johnny Silverhand can briefly speak with Godiva, the bartender at Atlantis, just before meeting Rogue. Godiva is the alias of Sergeant Melissa Wellingham of the British SAS, the sole survivor of an IRA ambush on her unit. After discovering that they had been betrayed by traitorous elements in the British government, she fled to the United States and took up work at the Forlorn Hope, a bar that was supposed to feature in Cyberpunk 2077. She's mentioned in Tales from the Forlorn Hope, published in 1992 for 2nd edition, so it's possible that she served a young Dylan Murphy, without either realising who the other was. And finally, there is the only overt reference to Ireland that I can find in Cyberpunk 2077. In the Shade of an Apple Tree, the most recent novel from Nobel Prize-winning artificial intelligence Virginia Grantchester. Set in 20th century Ireland, it's described as a masterpiece of post-collapse literature, a reference to the 1996 crisis in the United States that led to the bankruptcy of many of its cities. Ireland itself isn't mentioned in the short excerpt of the novel that we're shown, but I'd be shocked if Virginia hasn't thrown the "ra" in there somewhere. Contemporary attitudes and stereotypes heavily influenced the references to Ireland in the world of cyberpunk. Agrarian, untouched by modern civilization, and heavily dependent on handouts from the Irish and European governments, these depictions of Ireland share similarities with how it is portrayed in other fictional settings created around the same time. The British-authored sourcebooks present a heavily politicised British interpretation of the conflict in Northern Ireland, which is to be expected. But less expected is the presence of the IRA in Night City. They, and the vague, distant cause being fought in Ireland, are used in backstories of prominent characters, but have no bearing on the wider lore, and no political judgment, positive or negative, is passed. As yet, no sourcebooks have been released for Cyberpunk RED, featuring Ireland, but I have no doubt that the sequel to Cyberpunk 2077 is going to revolve heavily around the adventures of the Irish Republican Army in Night City. So this has been a comprehensive look at Ireland in the world of Cyberpunk. Thank you for joining me on this episode, I hope you enjoyed it, and if there are any references that I've missed, please do drop them in the comments below. I think I got all the major ones, but there might be a few buried in some of the sourcebooks that I couldn't get my hands on. If you'd like to see me flounder aimlessly through Cyberpunk 2077, check out my Twitch channel, there's a link in the description below, and I also have a video where I used Prison Architect to recreate the H-blocks, which is possibly the maximum security prison that Dylan Murphy escaped from. That actually gives me an idea for a short campaign set in Cyberpunk 2020. You have to break Dylan out of the H-blocks, then head with him to Night City to meet your contact and help get weapons back across the Atlantic. Your contact's name? Bobby Sands Devastan.